Thank you very much for joining us, Lord Deben. What do you see as the main climate risks we have in the UK at the moment, and are we on track to deal with them?
Well, we're not on track. We're in track in the sense that we've taken the first decision, which is that we've got to get to net zero by 2050, and that we have got some interim budgets to meet. And the government, I think, has been very brave in accepting those things. The difficulty is that that does demand action, and we've been much slower on the action than the targets. But there are many areas where we have got it right. I mean, saying there'll be nothing but electric or equivalent cars after 2030 has totally changed the car market. And we've seen company after company announcing that they're not going to do anything but electric cars much earlier than you would have expected. There are real steps, I think, on decarbonisation as far as what we've already done with offshore wind and what we're doing with solar and the programme that goes on, and the particular contribution which will come from the Prime Minister's commitment to a very large extension of our programme. But we still need a detailed strategy for net zero, and we're expecting that before COP26. But I'm afraid the government's taken rather a long time to do it, and very often the actual implementation of anything by government is much less good than policy.
We've seen quite a lot of momentum building around the whole net zero agenda in the past couple of years, but adaptation is a slightly different thing, isn't it? Are we seeing the same sort of progress there in terms of adapting to and creating more resilient cities?
No, we're not, and I think that's one of the problems, because I talked about mitigation first, because that's the way we have thought about it. And of course, you have to talk about that first, because unless we stop it getting worse, we're not going to be able to do anything. But you can't mitigate unless you also adapt. And we have to assume that at least we will get to 2 degrees warmer, because that's in the system now. Now, if we can pull it back to 1.5, that would be really valuable. But when you're doing adaptation, you should be assuming that you don't actually achieve even that end. And we might well have to prepare ourselves for 3 degrees warming, and that's really what we are not doing. We're doing quite a bit on flooding, and quite a bit in London on flooding, but not enough. And we haven't yet really got down to dividing stormwater from sewage, for example, and doing all those very basic things. And indeed, we're not doing the adaptation as far as heat is concerned. A lot of buildings in London will be unbearable with the increase in heat. And when you think of all those offices that were turned into or are being turned into flats, very few of them, if any, have got proper ventilation. They certainly aren't thinking of the kind of temperatures we're expecting and have already got. And I think it's also true, of course, insulation, so that we managed to get it wrong both ends of the scale. So there's a huge amount more to be done, and the government still hasn't produced its improvements in the building regulations. So we built 1 million houses since 2017, which will have to be retrofitted because the government didn't bring in the tougher measures in 2017, which it should have done.
But then one of our most intractable problems is dealing with existing buildings, isn't it, really, and improving their performance. What should the government be doing to try and address this issue? Because actually getting it out to householders across the country is a really tricky problem, but it must be solvable, mustn't it?
Well, it has to be solved, because if we don't, we can't meet net zero. It seems to me that, first of all, we shouldn't forget the government's been quite successful in the work that it has done through local authorities. And when its Green Deal went pear-shaped, it did put another £500 million into the into the programme for local authorities. And I think it is true in London that local authorities have really been doing much of the hard work. The reality is that we're not going to get the changes unless we do it on a street-by-street basis. You're going to have a lot more commonality in what we do, and local authorities are the only people who can do that. And I think if I were saying what is the priority in dealing with adaptation, it is to have a better relationship between government and local government. And I sometimes think that the Department of Local Government doesn't like local government. It seems to me, you know, it's a partnership that we want. And then, of course, it is true that we have got to get a better way of helping people to make these changes themselves when their old boiler blows up or breaks down or whatever happens, that they move to a better form of heating with heat pumps and the like. Now, the trouble is, at the moment, it's very hard to get these things and to understand how best to buy them. I both got an electric car and I put in air source heat pump in my home in the country. Buying an electric car is the easiest thing in the world as long as you've got the money for it. I admit they're expensive, but at the moment, but there are a lot of people out there who want to sell you a car and they know how to selling. You try buying a heat pump. It's really very hard indeed. You've got to find the people. Do you trust the ones that you find that they'll put it in properly? Can they explain to you what advantages there are? No, absolutely not. Even with the contacts that one obviously has as chairman of the Climate Change Committee, it took me a very long time to get the right mix. We've got it now, it's going very well, we're very pleased with it. But I have to say, so many friends who have wanted to do it and just found it either impossible or actually had cowboys putting these things in. So the government's really got to do more about making it easy for Mrs. Miggins to make this choice. There are a lot of people who'd like to do these things, who know that if they invest in it now, over the years, they will save money. The increase in the cost of energy, which we've recently seen, makes it even more attractive to do these things properly. But the government has got to help you do it and help you make the right choices. Because this is big money over the years. You're investing in the future. And I do think we've got to find ways of making it easier to be good and more difficult to be bad. Which means, for example, why on earth do we have the costs of going green put onto our electricity bills and not onto our gas bills? When we want people to move from gas to electricity. So what do? We make electricity more expensive. I mean, a balmier kind of concept, it would be very difficult to imagine.
Now, we talk about doing things street by street, and flooding is one of the big risks we have in London, with almost a fifth of London within the Thames floodplain. So yes. Do you think our planning system is fit for purpose, and what can we do to encourage the adoption of more nature-based solutions and sustainable urban drainage in London? I know we're building a huge super sewer, but we also need suds, don't we?
Yeah, I'm actually, I have to say, not in favour of the super sewer. We've now decided to do that. It seems to be very old-fashioned, almost three dam, you know, the old-fashioned way of doing it. I mean, what we should have done would be a whole series of localized programs where you make a distinction between the storm water and the sewage, which then enables you to keep the storm water, which we will increasingly need because we're going to be short of water, particularly in the hot summers. So I'm sorry that we made that step, and I tried very hard to stop it, but didn't win. But the question of sustainable urban drainage, SUDS, again, is one of those things that government has held up. It's not insisted upon it. It has allowed builders to act without using it. This is not sensible. And there's so much more to be done. And as far as London is concerned, then what we really need to do is to insist upon the planning system making sure that developers do not build in the places and in the way which makes flood prevention difficult, if not impossible. And that's why a new Planning Act is absolutely necessary. Very pleased that Michael Gove has gone to do this job, because he's got the toughness and he's got the position to be able to make the changes we need. We need an act which makes sure that the planning system has at its heart the need to reach net zero. At the moment, there's nothing in the planning system about net zero. Indeed, there's very little about any of the issues of climate change. And so you can't expect local authorities to be able to do their job properly if they don't have a planning system that backs them up. And I have every sympathy with the comments made by the Mayor of London, as others around the country of all political parties, that we need to have a planning system which makes it possible for local authorities to do their job properly. And that's essential.
Climate resilience more generally is, I mean, it's a pretty complex issue and harder to measure than maybe just CO2 emissions, and sits across lots of different stakeholders. I mean, who should be driving the agenda? I mean, how do we coordinate all those different bodies that have to work together to deliver this?
Well, I think that is part of the role of the Ministry of Housing and Local Government. I mean, I think that it can only be there because it can only be done through local government. But I think that there has to be a change of attitude, which is really important. And it's also got to recognise that other departments have a really important part to play. I mean, the Department of Education, I think, will be much more crucial, both in skilling people to be able to do the things we've been talking about. It's all right talking about sustainable urban drainage, but you've got to have people to make it, to build it, to do it. And if we're not careful, we'll have all these green jobs, which we certainly will have, but we won't have anybody trained to do them. So I'm very pleased again that Zadawi has gone to that department. He's certainly a real success story in terms of what he has done before in terms of the of coronavirus, but he's also a man of very considerable intelligence, which, if I may say so, is not always found in government. And he's certainly, I think, capable of doing this, and it really needs to be done. So there's a relationship there. The Department of Health is going to be very important in this too, because the National Health Service and leave alone anything else, its buildings and its plant and all the rest of it, really important part of resilience. And of course, getting it right for climate change is also getting it right for the future health of the nation. And I think the other thing that we really do need is a much more upbeat attitude of government. You know, very often they make the whole issue sound as if it's all a terrible series of painful decisions to be made. What I want to say to people is the world that we're building in order to combat climate change, in order to come out of COVID, is actually a better, cleaner, safer, kinder world than the one we live in now. And that we ought to be aware of the difficulties, of course, but we also ought to realise that it's not going to cost anything like as much as people thought. It's going to cost less than 1% of our gross national product every year. That most of that's coming from the local, or coming from the private sector. The Prime Minister and government have committed themselves to a programme which will enable those who can afford to do it, but those who can't to be helped. All that can come together and make a better society. And that's why I like to quote the Pope, because his wonderful reference to climate change, when he says in Laudato Si, his great encyclical, he says, climate change is the symptom of what we've done to the world. And when you have a symptom, that leads you to the disease. And what we've got to deal with is the disease. It's the return of biodiversity. Think what London could be like if we really concentrated on our green spaces and increase them and improve the wonderful parks that we've got, not only to sequestrate carbon for climate change, but to make it better for people's lives and their health, make it better for people's the air. Why we don't realize just how damaging to our health is the dirty air which we have. Cleaning up that is that pollution that we've done to the world. The way in which we have treated people. Modern slavery is a very good example of something else. All those people who suffer from it. This is what we can be doing. And I want the government to give people the feeling that we are on the way to living a better life in better circumstances. And it isn't all misery and sort of puritanism.
What should we expect to come out from COP26, and what do you expect to happen?
Well, there's a problem with COP26 because an awful lot of things have happened already. And so if you're not careful, because so much has happened already, you won't count that into it. But after all, let us be honest. You and I have been at these things for a very long time. And if you and I had had this conversation 10 years ago, we would never have believed that we would have moved as fast and as far. Let's just say every now and again, thank goodness to know where we are. Almost every country on earth has signed up to fight climate change. I think everyone has. Not that they will all do it, and of course there'll be backsliders and the like, but never before in history has that happened. We never believed that we could do that. We never believed that every industrialized nation is now, every serious nation except Australia is now signed up to net zero, and all but China net zero in 2050. Now, Australia is a scandal, and its Prime Minister has simply not understood that it is changing my climate. You know, I think people in London ought to be saying very clearly to the Australians, you haven't got the right to change my climate. And then we're asking you to join in the world. We've got to join the world because it's our climate that you're changing. And all this business about saying it's our decision and the rest of it is nonsense. They have got to understand, as the worst polluter in the world, I understand they now, on the latest figures, have per head of the population the worst pollution record as far as CO2 is concerned. But now, to start by saying that we might even not come to COP26 is really serious. So the truth is, we are a lot further along than I had ever thought. And the decisions made, the reason that one can talk about Australia like that is because so many other countries have come in to support what we want. And I believe also that the fact that we're committing ourselves to helping the developing countries to make the changes that they need to make so they can move from where they are to where they ought to be without the intervening dirty phase is crucially important. I think the government was both immoral and wrong to cut its cut its overseas aid budget. Quite the wrong thing to do. When you're in trouble yourself, you don't kick the people who are in worse trouble. It's I think just unacceptable. But it's also silly because actually we've got to prove to these countries that we are going to pay the cost. We've caused the problem. It's us rich countries that have caused the problem, and we are rich because of that pollution. So, you know, you don't have to be a great moralist to say that it is our job now to get the world out of it. And I'm confident that we will, and I think COP26 will be a success. We've just got to work very hard at it.
Very good. Well, Deben, thank you very much for your insights, and I hope that now Boris is best friends with the Australians. He might be able to put some pressure on them to change their views. So thank you very much.
Well, I hope so too. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.